All right, good morning, everyone. It's warmer this week. You're welcome. I put in a special request for it to be a little warmer today. Uh, it's going to be 70 on Christmas Day. So I don't know what to say about that. I was looking at the weather this morning. Um, I look at the weather a lot more now that I'm a little older. I don't. I guess that's just part. Is that like a rite of passage? Is that just? Yeah, I'm getting. Yeah, that's what happens. Okay. So yeah, it's gonna be 70 on Christmas, and I told that to Melanie, and she said, "Oh, that means there will be a tornado." I'm like, "Well, that's that's great. That's what we want. Merry Christmas." Nothing. Oh, the ache. By the way, okay. So there's about 20 people in this room right now. There's probably 10 to 20,000 watching online. I'm convinced. I, I have a hair in my mouth. There we go. My wife's hair gets everywhere. She places a hair inside my T-shirt that I wear every day. It tickles me. She just places it like right here. I don't know why she does that, but she does. She's very good at it. But all the people that aren't here today, they're not going to have to put up with maps or slides or any of that. There's no timeline, so you guys won. You guys won. We're going to start today um, with a reading from Daniel chapter 2, which is part of our reading for this week. Verse 44 is very long, but we're going to start at the very end of Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And this is the portion where Daniel has, um, King Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream. And he has challenged the wise men, astrologers, soothsayers, whatever you want to call them, of his kingdom. He has said, hey, you have to both tell me what the dream is, and then you have to interpret the dream. And his wise men were like, nobody can do that. That's not possible. Only the gods have that power. So Daniel, uh, empowered by the Lord, Daniel does this, and he's just finished explaining all of this to the king. And so we pick up at the very end of Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. This is Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So Daniel is one of the first exiles to go to Babylon. And we see that the Lord has prospered him by empowering him to reveal and interpret the dream that the Lord gave to King Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll talk a little bit more about that dream later today. I thought we were going to get to the fall of Jerusalem, but the truth is we're still 100 pages away in the Daily Bible. So we are not going to get there. So what I want to do is just kind of today and next week, just kind of summarize where all this is going. So let's fast forward and let's pretend we're 100 pages into the future and the Jerusalem has fallen. King Nebuchadnezzar has come in and all of this has happened. That Judah has been punished for their idolatry. All those prophecies over the last 400 years have happened. There has been death at every turn. Disease and starvation happened during the siege of Jerusalem, and there was death by the sword when the city falls. All of that's a prophecy, not just of Jeremiah, but of many prophets before him. The walls of Jerusalem are torn down, and the temple is destroyed, and a lot, not all, but a lot of the people of Judah are being marched to Babylon in exile. So all the horribleness has happened, right? That's where we are in the timeline. And so here's the question. Did they learn their lesson? And I don't say that in a flippant way, because I think that would be very unwise to say so in a flippant way. But the question is, after all of this, after all these hundreds of years of warning and up and down discipline, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and now that it's finally happened, the question is, did they learn their lesson? And if so, how do we know that? How do we know if they did or if they didn't? So the answer is yes, they did learn their lesson. Because the problem that the Lord has been identifying is this overt paganism and idolatry. People worship, quite literally falling down before foreign gods like Baal and Ashtaroth on the high places and under every spreading tree, and creating idols and worshiping these other gods. Like for real Hollywood movie paganism. Right? Like that. And from the biblical record, that kind of ended. Once the exile was over and once the remnant of the people returned to Judah, that particular problem, which is a pretty big problem, they didn't really have anymore. And so that certainly was a victory, and that was a turning point for God's people. This age old, since the very inception of the idea of that God's people were a people, from the seed of Abraham and how they grew into this enormous nation in Egypt, and then they traveled through the wilderness, and they went into the promised land, and they took over the promised land. There's this group of people, this enormous group of people. Idolatry had been a struggle for them this entire time. But after this, that seems to have waned. And so, at 9:08 a.m., they lived happily ever after. Merry Christmas. Let's all talk and have coffee. Wouldn't that be nice, Carlos? That would be nice. But just by virtue of your age and the fact that you're here the morning before the Christmas, Sunday before Christmas, you probably know that that's actually not the end of the story. But it is important to point out that that particular problematic sin did go away. Now, they had some struggles with some other sins. So, in our story, the people are in exile in Babylon, and we have people like Daniel, who's prophesying during that time in Babylon. We have people like Ezekiel, who are prophesying in that time, in that 70 years in Babylon. We have people like Jeremiah, who are still over here in Judah, and he is lamenting all that has happened. But then you fast forward 70 years, and the people return. And after they return, they have some struggles, not with idolatry per se, but with some other things. And we read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So the first problem is intermarrying with these other nations that have kind of come into Judah and quite frankly have always been there. So if we look in Ezra 9, after these things had been done, the leaders came to Ezra and said, "The people of Israel, including the priests and the Levites, have not kept themselves separate from the neighboring peoples with their detestable practices, like those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. They have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. And the leaders and officials have led the way in this unfaithfulness." Now, I am proudly from the Richpond and Woodburn area. I'm kind of like equidistant between those two. And you've heard me rail against the people of Rockfield, right? They're our arch enemies. But if something were to happen and one of my sons were to marry a young lady from Rockfield, I don't know. I don't know that I would go to him and say, son, don't mix the holy race with the people from Rockfield. It's just, eek. That's, I wouldn't say that. I might advise against, I probably wouldn't advise against it because that would be ridiculous. So, what is the big deal about intermarrying with these people? Why is that such a problem? And so, Nehemiah helps us understand what that problem is. And I don't know that this is a big reveal. I think you all probably know what's going on here. If we look in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 25, this is Nehemiah talking to the people. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? And so, to me, this is proof that this remnant kind of forgot a little bit about how they had got into this predicament. But then people like Ezra and Nehemiah were like, wait. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's how we got to where we were originally, because we were adopting the practices of these pagan nations. They were leading us astray, right? And don't hear that as like, you women, you're always leading us astray. Don't hear that. That's not what I'm saying. Who among us has not been led astray by a woman? As she gives me the head nod of disbelief. But God helped his people to kind of turn back from that. But that wasn't the only problem that they were having after they returned from Babylonian exile. Haggai talks about how the destroyed temple was kind of neglected. The people had not started to rebuild the temple. They had built homes for themselves, but they had not rebuilt the temple of the Lord. Nehemiah talks about how the people of Judah were oppressing the poor among them rather than kind of living together and working together. Nehemiah also talks about how the Lord's people were not keeping the Sabbath, how they had kind of adopted the practices of the people that were living in Judah or when they returned from the exile, and that the Sabbath was just another day. So during this time, which is kind of at the end of the Old Testament, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and to some degree Esther, kind of talk about what happened. And then you've got the prophecies of Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi that kind of talk about the Lord's instruction during this time. And that's kind of the end of the Old Testament, right? We're at the very end. But ultimately, this remnant of people, this purified remnant that returned back to Judah, rebuilt the temple, and they repented of their intermarriage with these foreign peoples that were living in the land of Judah and Benjamin. And this group lived for many years under a favorable rule by the Persian Empire. And so then that moves us into what we call the intertestamental period. And so that is just the time kind of between the Old and New Testaments. There's kind of a big block of time there that our Bible does not talk about. If you want to read the Bible that the Catholic Church uses, it has several books that talk about this time period. So during this time period, excuse me, no, let's back up. Okay, all right. So we started off this morning where Nebuchadnezzar had this dream and Daniel interpreted the dream for him. Now, what was this dream about? This is the first dream he had. So interesting. Does anybody know what the dream was? Big statue, my man. Good for you. It was a big statue. Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. There's a big statue. And this statue is made out of multiple types of metals. There was a head of gold. There was a chest of silver. There was a waist and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and then feet of what they call miry clay, or like iron mixed with clay. So this was his dream. And Daniel interprets this dream for him. And he said, "Oh, great king, may you live forever. The head of gold is you, great Nebuchadnezzar. You are the head of gold." And I mean, who among us doesn't want to be the head of gold? I mean, even the humble Ray Newton would love to be the head of gold. So the Babylonian Empire ruled over Judah during the time of the exile, but before the exile ended, the Babylonians were displaced by a new empire, as always happens. And this empire was the chest and arms of silver, the Persian Empire. So they came in and, as my father would say, whipped up on the Babylonians. I'm positive he never uttered that sentence in his life. But if he were here, I think he would say that. So the Persians came in, they whipped up on the Babylonians, just as the Babylonians had displaced the Assyrians. And this is the fulfillment of Scripture by the Lord. Jeremiah had prophesied that the Babylonians, that Nebuchadnezzar, that they would go a little too far with their punishment of the Lord's people, and that they would be put down, and that they would be subjugated. And they were. And so at the very end of the Old Testament, when Ezra and Nehemiah and all these people are returning, that is under the rule of the Persian Empire. But, like all the empires, the Persians are then displaced by another group. Now, who knows the name of the guy? Yes, Alexander the Great. Oh, you remember how all these slides that I've had that talk about Alexander the Great? He was the guy who swept eastward in a matter of 20 years and just took over the entire Persian Empire. And Alexander was from Macedonia, but more broadly, he was from Greece. Alexander was a Greek. And so now the Persians are displaced by the Greeks. And so the Greeks would then, Alexander died very young, but the remnants of his empire would have sway over not just Judah, but that entire part of the world for about 300 years. All right, now, we're doing good. We're doing good so far. What is the name? So remember, I took World Civ as a sophomore at Warren Central High School. There is a term that indicates the influence of the Greek culture over this wide empire that happened for several hundred years. It was a very, very big turning point in what we call Western civilization. Does anybody know the name for that term? Hellenism. That's right. I don't know who Helen was, but boy, she really made an impact. She must have had a podcast. So Hellenism, right? We all learned about Hellenism at some point. Every person in here learned about Hellenism when you were in Western Civ. Mark Moore's back there going, I never learned about Hellenism. So why are we talking about that in Sunday school this morning? So we're talking about that because during this intertestamental period that our Bible doesn't really talk a whole lot about, the differing parts of this empire, this Greek empire, are going to have a huge impact on Judah. And I don't know if you know this or not, but when we're in the Old Testament, that's a songbook. That's a song. Songbooks? What are songbooks doing here? Here we go. Here's a Holy Bible. So in the Old Testament, we don't know about Jews. And we don't know about people called Pharisees. And we don't know about people called Sadducees, right? That's not talked about. But then when we get to the New Testament, then we hear about things like synagogues and Jews and Pharisees and Sadducees and Sanhedrins and all this stuff. Where did all that come from? That all came from this intermediate period that our Bible doesn't talk much about. And so the Greek influence on the people of Judah resulted in kind of, interestingly, two factions. One faction was like, yay, Greeks! Yay, people in power! Yay, overlords! They endorsed because remember, Judah is always under the dominion of somebody for hundreds of years now. First it was the Assyrians, and it was the Babylonians, and it was the Persians, and now it's the Greeks. They are not self-determinate, right? We don't know what that's like. Praise God. But they did. And so there was a portion of the leadership especially that embraced this Greek way of life. And to some degree kind of embraced the Greek polytheistic worship, right? And we see that a little bit during this intertestamental period. Now, this group of people who was kind of in control of everything, that thought and that mindset is what would become the New Testament Sadducees. And so that sin, that problem, was this temptation and this threat that this old idolatry was going to come back. It was going to supplant the Lord, even after they had been so good for so many years. But then another group had a kind of a backlash to that. They're like, we do not want this Greek culture to influence us, because the Greek culture, unlike the Persian culture, really permeated into every aspect of life. I don't know if you know this. You know this. But in the New Testament times, everybody spoke Greek. Like you spoke something, but then you also spoke Greek. Everybody spoke Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. Why? Because that culture had permeated through that entire area, the area that we call the Middle East. And actually, larger than that. So this Greek culture was really threatening the existence of the Lord's people. And so there was a backlash against that in the people of Judah. And they said, hey, listen, we have to learn our lesson from the exile. We cannot adopt the ways of this foreign people and their foreign gods, no matter how good it is for business. And so that group of people would become what we call the Pharisees of the New Testament. But they had their own problems, as we all know. Their focus was on following God's law and keeping like their culture separate. But that kind of gave rise to the sin of legalism and the sin of kind of doing these religious practices but not really having the heart that went along with it. So that had its own problems. So by the time that we get to our New Testament and the time of Jesus, another empire has taken over from the Greeks. And who was that? Rome, that's right. Oh, the Romans. Oh, man, those guys. Rome had taken over by now. And they were the legs of iron and the feet of clay, and they from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, during this time, the Roman Empire was kind of in a peaceful place. A lot of this like uproar and turmoil and like fighting at the top had stopped. And now this is like for super bonus points, all right? The only person that may know this in here is my daughter. It is. Oh, red and green. Merry Christmas. there is a time about 200 years in the Roman Empire around the time, and it encompasses the time of our New Testament, where it is a peaceful time in the Roman Empire. Peaceful meaning that they had basically crushed everybody else. Does anybody know what that's called from World Civ class? Ooh, get totally dominated. Pax Romana, that's right. So this thing that you learned about in World Civ class, the Pax Romana, this Roman peace, the time of Jesus and the apostles is inside that. Well, how do you keep the peace? I don't know if you guys are very good at empire building, but the way that you keep the peace is if Carlos starts to run his mouth and cause some trouble, you come in and you crush him, and then he doesn't cause any more trouble. So that's how you keep the peace. That's how the Romans kept their pax. Thank you, sweetie. So at this time, military and like broad political power are in the hands of Rome. But Rome was pretty smart. They took a page out of the playbook of the Persians and they said, hey, you can just worship whatever God you want to. That's fine. As long as you pay us our taxes, you can do whatever. That's not our business. And so the Romans allowed the people of Judah, and I presume people other places, to worship whatever God they wanted to in whatever ways they wanted to. As long as the tax money kept flowing, they were happy. And so this situation is what allowed kind of, I don't know, I'm going to say foment, that's too uppity. The fact that there was not self-determination. There was not a king in Judah during this time, right? It was ruled by Roman governors like Pilate. That allowed this other piece over here, this religious piece, that elevated the importance of that in the people's lives. And so worship kind of became a place to have political power inside of a broad environment where you did not have militaristic type of political power. You know what I'm saying? And so in that, we have the rise of the Sadducees, who controlled the temple worship and controlled the Sanhedrin and kind of controlled a lot of stuff in Jerusalem, right? We have the Sadducees, but then we also have this other sect, the Pharisees, who had power through controlling teaching and learning in the synagogues that were dispersed throughout Judah. And so you have these two groups that are kind of running the non-military piece of Judah during the time of Jesus. And whenever political power, political meaning of the people, when political power gets infused in with the worship of the Lord, bad things happen. And so let's hear from the words of Jesus. And he is speaking to one of those groups, the Pharisees. This is from Matthew 23. This is very familiar to you guys. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and every other unclean thing. In the same way, on the outside you appear to the people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. And it does. So, where we have been, and all this talk, I've been running my mouth for all these weeks now about this spot where we're like, hey, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon is coming, is coming, is coming, is coming. All right, so we got there. And now we've hopped forward several hundred years to the intertestamental period and the Greeks and all that, blah, blah, blah. And then we've hopped forward to the time of Rome. And then in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed again. About 600 years from when it was destroyed by the Babylonians, it is destroyed again by the Romans. And they come in, just like the Babylonians, and they lay siege to the city. And just like at the time of the Babylonians, there is death by disease and starvation and awful, awful things happen during that siege. And eventually, they breach the walls, and they come in, and they kill a bunch of people, and they burn the city, and they tear down the walls, and they destroy the temple, the second temple that was built way back over here when the exiles came home from Babylon. When Ezra and Nehemiah and those folks came and they rebuilt that second temple, not quite as fancy as the first one, but when they rebuilt that temple is then destroyed by the Romans. And to this day, it has not been rebuilt. You can go to see its ruins in Israel with Jim Wright, plug for the trip, this summer, if you want to. So, with about 10 minutes remaining, what does all of this mean? So the fundamental problem that God's people have had this whole time had really never been solved. So you have an imperfect people trying to connect and relate and follow and be like a perfect God. And those two things it's really hard for those to inhabit the same space. That has just fundamentally not worked very well. And so you have things like idolatry, and you have things like self-righteousness and disobedience and legalism and greed and murderous hearts. And all of those things are really just different colored crayons inside the same box, right? Those are just different varieties of the same problem. And that problem was if the Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD here, and Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC here by the Babylonians. Well, this problem that we have is really a problem that is from way, 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 way over here. And it is from the very beginning in the garden. I have never been over here. It's nice. Hey, it's very nice over here. Hey, John. Hey, Josh. But this problem that they've had, it's the same one from the garden, right? The problem is a sin problem. It's not just idolatry. It's not just greed. It's not just unrighteousness. It's not just disobedience. The problem is a sin problem. And I don't say this to this audience or the thousands and thousands watching at home like you don't know that. Please do not hear me say that like I'm teaching you something new. You all knew that. It's not a surprise. But when I say sin, I'm not just talking about not doing the things that you should. Oops, I was supposed to not pull my cart on the Sabbath day. And I'm not just talking about sin like doing things that you shouldn't. Oh, I took advantage of my neighbor and I took their cloak as security for a loan that I gave them even though it was cold outside. So it's not just those types of sin. But what I'm talking about is what Paul talks about in the New Testament as sin is this impossible roadblock, this thing that we cannot overcome because the imperfect, that's me and you, for sure me, probably you. The imperfect never can and never will be perfect, no matter how long or how hard we try. And we certainly won't be perfect if we don't try that hard or that long. And so, an example of this, maybe, is that so when where am I in my timeline? So if this is Babylon, and if that's the garden, then about here we'll say about here is where um, Moses and Joshua had led the people out of Egypt into this promised land. And then they went into this period where they had these judges, different leaders that kind of led them through difficult times. And then at some point, the people said, "Give us a king. Give us a king like all the people around us." But the Lord was their king, right? Not Saul, not David. The Lord was their king. He was the perfect king. But the people, they wanted a human king, a tall, handsome man like Phil Kimball. That's what they wanted. And the Lord's like, careful what you fish for. You're not going to like the results of this. But this imperfect people, and let's don't judge too harshly. This imperfect people thought that that was a great idea, right? That they would have a king and they could have an army, and that army would protect them. That this Lord from this God from on high, this invisible God that in many cases they were scared to death of, he wouldn't do a very good job of that. But this king would. And that's an example of an imperfect people not being able to see a perfect solution. And I know that doesn't happen to any of you guys, but it happens to me all the stinking time. And so as we begin to close out our study of this part of God's story, I want you to consider a couple things. First off, over all these long, many years, gotta take my notes with me. Over all these long, many years, starting back in the garden, much love to you, Nathan Jones. Starting back in the garden, over all these many long years, God had been solving the sin problem. God showed his people how to be like him. He gave them a lot of specific examples. To be like me, you'll do these things. And he showed them how to love other people through very specific examples. And we call that the law of Moses. He was like, here's a bunch of things, and if you'll do these things, and then you'll be a lot like me. A lot like him, not me, him. So he gave us that as he's resolving the sin problem. And then when the people were like, meh, we're imperfect, we're not very good at following that. So when the people didn't do that, then God said, well, I'm going to send you some people. And they're going to speak for me. And they're going to be like, hey, don't forget, when you loan somebody some money and you take their cloak, make sure that you give it back to them at nighttime. Don't be greedy. Quit murdering each other. God sent those people to tell them, to tell the people. And not just the people, to tell the leaders. And we call those people the prophets. And God is trying to solve the sin problem. He's solving the sin problem. And then when we get to here, 586 BC, Babylonians, and went after, we're back here. But even though he sent his prophets, boy, his children just had a really hard time understanding what they wanted to do. And they had a really hard time, like some of us maybe, deciding to do the things that would help them become like him. And so, just like any good parent, he would punish them. He would send some people in to kind of teach them a lesson. But then, he would always send somebody to rescue them out of that, out of the hands of those people that he provided to kind of correct them and to say, listen to me. Can you hear me? And he would send a rescuer. And we called those people the judges. And then finally, after a long time of warning, God destroyed Jerusalem, his city. He destroyed the temple, his dwelling place on earth, and he exiled much of the people. And he said, all right, this is enough. I'm just going to start over with a few of you. Right? I'm just going to try again. Kind of like the story of Noah, I guess. But ultimately, God did solve the sin problem. But he didn't use imperfect people. He didn't use kings and prophets and priests. He didn't use those people anymore. But then, interestingly, he didn't just do it from his throne on high either. He did it in this interesting way. He did something different. He became one of us. Isn't that interesting? All these imperfect people, he was solving this problem. He's solving. And so finally, when he solved it, in proper grammar, when he solved the problem, he said, well, I think I will just become one of them. And then he came and he taught us himself with words from his own mouth. It didn't have to get translated through a prophet. He didn't have to go through a priest. God came and he lived among us and he taught us with his own mouth. But because sin equals death and sin requires a sacrifice, and we learned that through all this long period, all through here we learned that sin requires sacrifice. Sin equals death. And we had to have a sacrifice. So then God said, well, what is it that I can sacrifice that fixes this sin problem forever? And he said, oh, well, the only way I can do that is by sacrificing myself. And so just like with the judges, he rescued us, but forever. Not just from the Philistines, but he rescued us forever. And all he's ever asked of us, from way over there to here, where he destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and I guess out there by the information booth is where we are. Maybe a little further. All he's ever asked is that we believe in him and him alone. And that belief, which we now call love, it's got to permeate all that we are and all that we do, because it permeates all that he is and all that he does. So that was the first thing. And then here's the second thing. We're going to get out on time. It'll be a little late. So the second thing I want you to remember is that when doom and destruction occur, that there is no one closer to that doom and that destruction and that suffering than the Lord. If you see a starving child somewhere, very close to home or far, far away, be assured that he sees not just that starving child, but he sees all starving children everywhere. And he sees every moment of every day of every starving child. He's there. And when you see a sick person, you can be assured that he is with them in every difficult breath and in every lonely second when you're not with them. He's with them. And if you see people that are killed by the sword, you need to understand that the Lord sees that. And he doesn't just see it through the eyes of the person that was killed. He also sees it through the eyes of the killer. He sees it both ways because he is the greatest Father of all time. And no one can compare to him. So, right as the bell rings, do two things. Pray for wisdom to accept what God is doing today, as hard as it may be. And then pray for strength to endure the difficult things, that we might be able to glorify God despite those things. Because if by God's wisdom and by God's strength, you and I can do these two hard things, which is to recognize God is at work in difficult and challenging and awful times, and if we can access the strength he gives us to endure those and glorify him, if we can do those two things, then an unbelieving world will see us and they will turn to him, because they will go, that's not possible. Nobody can do that. But when they see us do it, they'll be like, oh, wow, that is crazy. How are you able to do that? And that's all. Merry Christmas.